Hello, my name is Tanya. I make things, and this week I was figuring out quilt labels. I thought I'm just going to share what I've discovered while searching things on the internet and also doing some experiments. My situation is I'm not experienced in this. I don't do embroidery. I have some things laying around, but I'm not really proficient in anything. So I was trying to figure out what I can do with what I have. And here are my findings. The algorithm of making a quilt label is I'm going to talk about this. So step 0 is actually figuring out if you need a quilt label or not. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the end. And I'll start with practical things first. So the first step is deciding what you want to have on your quilt label. I found a simple formula on the internet, and that's name of the quilt, name of the maker, name of the recipient, maybe a place where it was made, and a date. You can add things to that, you can remove things from that if you don't know who the quilt is for example. But I think that that's a good place to start. But what I've also discovered is it's important to start with something and maybe modify it as you do your experiment and your samples, because my mind was totally changed from when I started this whole experimentation process to when I finished the experimentation process. I have a whole new idea about how to go about this. So I think it's important to make sure that you have enough time for experimentation, because in the beginning I thought, well, I have this idea, I need to make this quilt label, I'm going to do it in one evening and it's going to be done and fun and great. No. It's been several days and I'm still in the trenches. So the first thing that we need to decide is what we want on our label, but it's not written in stone, so you can change it later when you figure things out for yourself. Second step is designing the label. I recommend doing it on a computer if you have one, because letters are difficult. Unless you're really good in calligraphy or hand lettering, in which case you know more about this than I do, but our regular handwriting doesn't look very good. It takes a lot of practice to have good handwriting, especially if you're making something like a label that's going to be seen by other people. If it doesn't bother you, if your handwriting is good and you think that it adds character to whatever you make, that's great. But I personally would design my labels on a computer always. And there are many free fonts available on places like Google Fonts. You can find a great collection of really nice, quirky, high quality fonts that you can download and use in your word processor or something and design a label to your liking. Here are the fonts that I've chosen for my embroidery. Because I'm going to be embroidering, I've chosen text that has almost no line width variation. I also was trying to choose something a little bit wonky, because when I do my embroidery it's going to be wonky, and when the text is really straight like this, and making it wonky will make it look bad. If I'm choosing something that's already very artistic, being a little bit wonky won't hurt it too much. And I have printed my samples in 3 different sizes. and in two different fonts so that I can experiment with what is going to look best. I probably won't be trying those two because they're too big in my opinion, even though for some people maybe that's the right size. It just makes me a little bit uncomfortable making something that big. I'm going for the middle because those small bits are a little bit too small, but the middle is just about right, I think. The third step is somehow transferring the design onto fabric, and the intermediate stage is putting it onto paper. If you have a printer, that's great. You can just print it out. If you have a laser printer, you can take the print, um, make a mirrored image, print it out, and put it on top of your piece of paper and apply some acetone on the back, and this way ink is going to transfer to whatever is below the paper. I'm not sure if it's going to leave a permanent mark on your fabric, but it might work as temporary way to transfer the picture so that you can do something with it later. If you don't have a printer, it's possible to just trace the image from a computer screen onto a thin piece of paper. It's not fun, but it works. I was testing this idea using my iPad. I didn't like it, but it's something that works. And the most annoying thing that happens is that the screen reacts to my hands touching, so I was covering the screen with bits of fabric so that it doesn't pick up the movements of my palm, but it's really hard because you cannot rest your hand on the screen while you're tracing the image. But it can be done. Yeah, so that's transferring from computer to paper, and then we need to transfer it from paper to fabric. And the best way to do it is with some kind of light source. Actually, you can use a computer screen that has a complete white background as a light box. You can use an iPad as a light box with all the difficulties that I've described earlier. You can use a window as a light box, and that's probably the most logical thing. It's just a little bit uncomfortable. And you can build a light box, a light table using something like plexiglass and the lamp from beneath with chairs, the way we did it in the olden days. Actually, if you're going to do something like this regularly, you can invest in one of those things. It's a light box with LEDs. Those things used to be really hard to find and really expensive, and now they're very, very cheap and affordable. So maybe it's not that much of an investment. I just happen to have one. I wouldn't buy it for this thing, though. There are different ways to mark your fabric. I prefer those pens. They're heat removable. Sometimes I use just water soluble pens, but they tend to disappear on me pretty fast, so do some tests probably. We're going to use this pen, and again some very cheap fabric. I'm going to go for a medium size here. First let's do this one. I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to use it in a quilt, but I do need to make sure that it fits in a hoop. The way you transfer the design onto your fabric is going to depend on how are you going to make it permanent, and that's our next step. A brief overview of things that you can do. There are special labels that you can put in a laser ink printer. I've read about them. So you can buy something and just put it through the printer and print directly onto fabric. I don't have one of those. Next, you can actually order a custom stamp, a rubber stamp, and use special ink that goes onto fabric. And as far as I can understand, it's permanent, so you can just stamp your design onto your label and have it permanent this way. I was considering this idea, but it doesn't allow you to have your quilt name and year, and maybe you'll have to order a new yearly stamp and maybe add a name of the quilt if it has one, name of the recipient if it has one, by hand somehow. But the idea of having a custom stamp is really nice. I like this. What's next? There's an idea that you can use a archival quality ink marker felt pen, like a micron. I have one of those. It's supposed to be permanent. I did a little experiment that I'm going to show you. Now I'm going to try writing on fabric with my archival inks. We'll see if it bleeds, if it does anything, if it goes away. Then later I'm going to give this a wash, see what happens to the ink. But because it's a pen, I'm going to choose the smallest sample and just try transferring to the fabric. I was really opposed to this idea in the beginning because I didn't think that it would look good. It actually does look good, and I think that that's a good option if it does work, which I'm not sure it does. I also forgot to mention that it's a good idea to stabilize your fabric. I don't have any stabilizer on me, so I didn't do this. It gave me a little bit of trouble, but if you can stabilize the fabric before you transfer your design onto it, it's a good idea. Just a reminder. Yeah, so we're making it permanent. I chose embroidery for my labels because I think that it suits the medium. It looks good and it is pretty permanent, even though thread also isn't completely permanent, but it's relatively permanent. If the thread kind of falls apart, maybe the quilt also falls apart, so it doesn't matter. Embroidery is relatively straightforward. I've searched for some stitches that we can use for stitching letters, and the first idea that came up was just using very small backstitch. I've tested this idea and I have a feeling that you can get better with practice, because my first test was really wonky, and then I spent some time with it and I got better, but it surely has a character. The second thing that I looked up, because I discovered that, well, that's not going to work for me, it's not good enough, I've discovered that you can do a split backstitch, and that's like a regular backstitch, but when you come back you stitch through the middle of the previous stitch, and this way all the stitches are kind of interconnected and it gives you a lot more smooth curves and a lot more connected lines, and it looks better, and it also gives a little bit more width and dimension to the stitching. I have a very limited collection of embroidery floss. I have a little bit of this. Then I have 2 balls of Finca embroidery thread. It's a pearl 16 and 12, and none of these are good for what I'm going to do. So I'm going to use regular sewing thread. I also have this iris thread, but it's way too thick. So I went with sewing thread 40/2. I don't know what that means, but probably thickness. I'm going to take something that you'll be able to see. As I was researching how do I stitch letters onto a fabric, the first thing that came up was just do a very small backstitch. That's what we're going to try first. I'm going to double my thread. The only thing I know about embroidery for sure is that knots are not allowed. So I'm going to start in the beginning and put my thread in here, and I'm going to do this so that I don't have a knot. And then we proceed doing very small backstitch like so. I'll see you in a bit. So after experimenting with the regular backstitch, I've realized that it doesn't really work for me, so I've started looking for something else, and the internet told me to try the split backstitch, which is also not complicated, so it's going to work on a very small scale, and it's told to handle curves better. So let's see how it does. The idea is that we do a backstitch, but we'll land it in the middle of the previous stitch, and it helps us to control the curve. And in the end, the stitches look more connected, and it just overall looks better, and it's a bit more voluminous. Here is a sample that was made with a pen. I actually didn't think that I would like this, but I do. I think that if it works, it's a very good option because it looks very neat. You can control the lines, you can make letters small. I think that's a great option if it does work, but I'm not sure if it does. Here I have a sample stitched with a simple back stitch. We'll see how it looks pressed in a moment. And here is a split back stitch. Very, very smooth. So let's get those pressed. I actually prefer how regular backstitch looks when it looks good, but it's easier to make it look good with a split backstitch. That's what I discovered. So I'm going to show you now the finished samples. Another thing that I've learned the hard way is that I was using regular sewing thread because I didn't have embroidery thread of any interesting colors. I have like white and variegated greens of 2 colors. So I took a regular sewing thread, and one of the samples I did with like a brown and another with a green, and the brown, when I ironed it, because I'm using a heat removable pen, when I ironed one sample, it went fine, and the other samples, the threads melted because they're 100% polyester, and I didn't just realize that. So you live and you learn, but it's still possible to see what happened because I reacted in time to save the rest of the sample, but it's a bummer, and I probably will have to invest in some embroidery thread to finish my labels. But that was good enough for the samples because I have all the information now that I need to make my real samples now. So now when we did all of this hard work, making our samples, figuring out what's the best way to make a quilt label, for me, I think that I'm going to go with a split back stitch and choose some proper thread for it. But I'm going back to the beginning, which is figuring out, do I even need one? And that's a question that I had to think about a lot. So initially, I didn't really question whether or not I was going to have a quilt label or not. I just came up with a cool name for my green quilt. And so I got really excited to make this label for my quilt, to put the name of the quilt on the label so that it would be named, it would be cool, and I had this really cool idea, so I just got carried away, excited, and I didn't even question, do I need a label? Of course I do, because I have this cool name. I need to put it on a quilt. And the other thing that I think is really cool about labels is dating the quilt, because sometimes I see makers who don't even remember when a quilt that they made was made, and it's really cool to go back and see, oh, I made it 10 years ago, I made it 15 years ago. And I always have this image in my head of some kids discovering a quilt 150 years from now on an attic somewhere, and finding it in some kind of box and thinking, oh, that's so cool. It was made 150 years ago. It's so old. And so I think that dating a quilt is really cool. And if it's a present inside a family or maybe to close friends, it's a good idea to mention who made it and for whom it was made. But other than that, if I'm going to sell a quilt, and I think that that's a real possibility for me, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with people somewhere in a different house having my name, my legal name, on a quilt in their house, especially if it's made for a child. And I'm not sure if I would want a random woman's name on my child's quilt. I don't have any children, but if I did, I'm not sure if I would be comfortable with that. And probably I have a difficult relationship with my name. I don't really like it. Yana is not my real name. It kind of is because my name is Tatiana. Usually it's shortened to Tanya, but I could theoretically use Yana as a shortened version of my name, but nobody calls me that. That's a different story for another time why I chose that for the channel, but I'm not really attached to my name, and I don't like it seen written. It's a weird thing, and as I was stitching those samples, I'm going to show you the samples that I've started with, and here is one where I've covered my last name and the name of the town where I live, because it's a very small town. I don't want to be found. I started with just name of the quilt, my full name, name of the town, and the date. And here I have the same situation in a different stitch, in a different font. And it felt wrong. I just didn't like seeing my name written like this. And I think that I would be more comfortable seeing my nickname or something like a brand name, and I came up with the whole kind of branding situation in my head. How can I call, the studio consisting of one person, to make this into a brand, to make it less personal, but to make it still traceable to the original maker if somebody wanted to figure out who made this thing. But having like a brand name isn't as invasive, I think, into other people's homes. And what I finally figured out is that I will probably have to come up with a maker's mark. I think that maker's marks are cool, and I'm going to make something small, something that can be easily stitched onto a quilt, but it's not going to be openly my legal name and address. So this way I can be found out, like people can find me if they need to, but at the same time it's just going to be a little mark on a corner of a quilt showing who it was made by. So I think that in the end, what I'm going to write on the quilt is going to be the name of the quilt, the date, and a maker's mark. A small little thing that's not going to be very invasive, and that's not going to make me feel like I'm exposing some personal information about myself. That's the plan. And it made me do a lot of soul searching, I have to say, because why am I uncomfortable with this idea? What's going on? Is there something wrong with me? It looks like anybody who I've talked to didn't feel anything wrong with the idea of signing a quilt with my name. It feels like a me problem. And it's women's work. It often goes unrecognized, and I think that signing your work is important, and being proud of your work is important, and signing it makes it feel important. And if it's a wall hanging, so it's like a painting, then it's logical to sign it. But if it's a quilt, if it's something that I'm just going to cover my bed with, I don't know. It feels different. Even though it's not. Most of the quilts that I've made to this date are dog beds. My dog sleeps on them. So, I don't know. I would definitely put a maker's mark on a dog quilt. And if I didn't do anything else, I would actually write the year that the quilt was made somewhere in the corner, because I think that that's the coolest thing that you can do to a quilt, is just sign the year. And this way, 150 years ago, when those kids find that quilt somewhere in the attic, they're going to know how old it is. That's all that I care about, really. And yeah, so I'm going to leave you with that. I hope that it was helpful in some way, and I'm going to see you next week with something else. Yeah,